Hi again. I'm doing another a book uh, reading challenge um, report. I don't know what you call these things. Just something to get out there. Anyway, the one that I'm sorry about that. The one I'm talking about today is called "The Sleepless" by Victor Manipo. Maybe it's a debut novel, and that's the category for my challenge. And it is a bang up debut novel. It was very well done. Um, it was another pandemic story. I think I'm just going to have to resolve myself to the idea that at least this year, almost everything is going to be a pandemic story of one sort or another. I'm really over them already. Um, this one is not the average. This is a family living through the pandemic. It's a new pandemic story about a different kind of pandemic. In this story, COVID didn't really exist. Um, so the sleepless pandemic is that people get sick and then they don't sleep like ever again for any reason, and they don't need to. And then it causes pure chaos because some people can work like 24 hours a day because they don't get exhausted and they don't need to, and there really isn't anything else to do because they still have the same issues of discrimination and people being quarantined and all that crap. And then in this story, it becomes very much about the economics of a pandemic and the people that are involved. And so the main character is a journalist who is researching this new disease, and I bet you can figure out where it goes from there. um, it does sort of have I mean, when you're reading it, you're like, oh yeah, obviously this is what's going to happen. It doesn't come across as like it's not obvious, like this is where it's going to go and this is where it's going to end up. Kind of, a little bit, but not really. So it does sort of, once you're there, you're like, oh yeah, obviously this is where it's going to be. But it's not only about this disease. It's very much about the disease, but it's not only the disease. My hair is making weird shadows. Anyway, like I said, it was a really good debut novel. The biggest problem I had with it, I mean, yes, of course, I'm over pandemic stories. I'm like, please, please, somebody write something that's not a pandemic story. Maybe I'm going to have to start reading picture books, but I bet there are picture books about the pandemic. Anyway, the biggest problem I had with this book, and it's a writer thing for sure, is something I call the evil middle. This is the curse of well, definitely like new writers definitely cope with the evil middle, because when you're writing, you know, when you start, you've got all these characters to introduce, you've got the world to introduce, you know, you've got to describe everything, you've got to have, you know, their relationships put down, you have to have the basic story put down, you have all this stuff that you have to write about, and so it really is pretty easy to write about. And then the end, of course, you're wrapping everything up. They're all the, you know, the things that you've dropped into the book. Suddenly you've got it. the payoffs are there, everything else. I mean, so the end is usually pretty easy to write too, but the middle sometimes is not easy to write. Like I said, I call it the evil middle. It gets boring as a writer to write the middle of a book. You feel like you have to wait until you've put some distance in before you start having these things pay off. If you don't have a huge number of characters that can interact with each other, then it really it gets to be like, okay, is this a waiting game? Is what's going on? Sometimes people set up a whole bunch of sort of red herring mini adventures that you start, worrying about them, and then they almost immediately resolve because it's not important enough. The author doesn't want to bother with it. This book had a little bit of that, for sure. That, but I mean, it sort of fit because the point is that these people that get this disease are like bored out of their mind because, every day is half again as long as anybody else's. And, a lot of your life is, revolves around going to bed and preparing to go to bed and the ritual of like setting your alarm for the morning and all that and figuring all that stuff out. And not, if you don't have to sleep, you don't have to do any of that. So, and then it had all this stuff that really went back to like pandemic lockdown of COVID, where they've got the hobbies where he's learning all these new things that, like with real COVID, when they had that thing where everybody was making sourdough bread and then everybody was doing tie-dye crap. And I'm like, okay, just because they're bored and they didn't have anything to interact with. So if you've got people that are awake 24 hours, then, when most people are sleeping, they can't interact with them and they go bored and crazy and they come up with a million hobbies. And the same with if they are being discriminated against and people shun them. Same thing, well, you got to fill your time somehow, and then it becomes an economic thing because, of course, one of the ways that people could fill their time is by getting a second or a third job even and working all the time. And then there's a shift, that maybe it's something desirable. And is it something desirable? And you think that's what the book is going to be about, but there is actually sort of like a whodunit kind of in the middle of it. So it's trying to fuse genres, or it's trying to use the one as the excuse for the subgenre, or most likely, again, because it has this problem, the evil middle, the author is not quite skilled enough to really fill out the story and put everything in there that maybe could have been in there, that maybe it needed. And then is also going along with the sort of, I don't know, I call it a trick of, hey, I've got this new pandemic that everybody's going to be talking about, that sort of thing. I don't know. Like I said, this sounds like I'm trashing the book. It's more like I'm trashing how it was structured. I think that the way the book is written, it works. It's pretty good, like I said. I'd recommend it. But I think it would have been interesting if the two storylines that were fused and intertwined were actually separated into two different books, two different stories. Like I said, I don't think this author right now could have actually handled writing a book about one or the other. And so put them together, ta-da, I've done that before. I had two ideas and put them together, and it worked much better together than either did separately. But it was because I wasn't skilled enough to flesh out the books enough for them to go on their own. So I think this is a writer that's probably like one to watch. It'll be really interesting to see how it gets sort of, you know, I don't know, like the evolution of the writing, I guess. And to see what better skills, because people just they don't, come out boom as a great writer. And you can have a really good story. And like I said, I think the pandemic thing right now is like trendy. And every publishing house wants to have at least 1, 2, 6 pandemic stories that's different. It's a different kind of pandemic story because it's like taking this traditional sort of whodunit and putting it with a brand new pandemic that's nobody's ever heard of, and it wasn't really explored anywhere near as well or as deeply as it could have. Like, really, this idea of this type of sleeplessness pandemic idea in somebody like Philip Roth, he could have really nailed that and hit it out of the park. Great idea. Writing is not quite there yet, but it's a debut novel and a really good one. And I think this is one to see where it's going to go, because this writer could either go, that was my one and done, or they can keep honing their skills, and future books are going to be spectacular if that's the case.